Good evening, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. My name is Carl Friedoff. I'm a fellow on public opinion and Asia policy here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And it's my pleasure to welcome Jonathan Hillman from CSIS here to discuss the Belt and Road Initiative this evening. For nearly a century, the Council has provided an independent, nonpartisan platform for a variety of different voices to promote deeper global understanding and active U.S. engagement in the world. By way of disclaimer, I will say that the views that you're going to hear tonight represent those of the speakers. There's not institutional positions of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Throughout the program tonight, I will have this little tool open where you can submit questions online. If you go to ccga.live, there you can input your questions. They'll pop up here, and then I'll try to work them in to the discussion. Also, throughout this, I'll note that we will have an open Q&A at the end of the session. Joining us tonight, as I mentioned, John Hillman from CSIS, where he is a senior fellow with the CSIS Simon Chair in Political Economy, and he's the director of the Reconnecting Asia Project. Formerly, he served as a policy advisor at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. He received his bachelor's from Brown University and a master's from the Kennedy School at Harvard. So please welcome me in joining John Hillman. Now, as we jump into this, I'm going to start off with just a couple numbers. I mentioned that he's the director of this Reconnecting Asia, and if you go to that website, it is a real treasure trove of a lot of data that is in there, whether all the projects that they're doing throughout Europe, throughout Southeast Asia, and a few in Northeast Asia, along with a lot of the backing information about who is funding this, in some cases how much they're funding it, and they also have kind of helpful little infographics like this. So, just to kind of frame this in a way, the numbers that are put up here, it's the Belt and Road Initiative is touching kind of 4.6 billion lives, which is about 61% of the world's population. The combined GDP of all the countries involved is 29 billion, and there are $6 trillion, or 29 trillion, and then $6 trillion in trade between China and BRI countries. But as this has kind of unfolded, there's been a lot of debate about what BRI is, what China's kind of initiatives are, what their strategic goals are. So to get us all kind of started on the same foundational ground, I'll turn to John and kind of throw out the first question of, what do you think BRI is? And more importantly, maybe what is it not?
I think it's a great question. And I think reasonable people can disagree about what the Belt and Road is and isn't. So I guess let me start by saying thank you for having me, and it's a lot of fun to be here. I read and consume a lot of the reports that this organization puts out, and commend those to you. When we're thinking about Belt and Road, this is something that was announced in 2013 by Xi Jinping, and it was announced initially in two components. There was an overland belt, which was announced in a speech at Nazarbayev University, and then a maritime Silk Road, which was announced in a speech to the Indonesian parliament. Since then, about 6 years of activity, this thing has steadily expanded and expanded and expanded. And so now, estimates on this can range a bit, but I think the last number I saw was there's 131 countries who have signed agreements or expressed that they are participating in this initiative. So that's most of the world. This has expanded beyond just the overland and maritime dimensions to include a new Arctic dimension, to include cyberspace, and even to include outer space. So the Chinese constellation of satellites, Baidu system, which is an alternative to GPS, is counted as part of this initiative. The part that I focus on is infrastructure, and I think that's important because it's both often the carrot, the incentive to sign countries up to participate, as well as the political economy from China's perspective, the incentive and sort of self-interest in pursuing this vision because it's assisting many of their state-owned enterprises who have grown too big to build projects at home anymore and want to find new markets. So that's a long way of saying that this began as something, it's expanded into something else, and it continues to change as well. I think the Belt and Road as it exists today is certainly not what it was 6 years ago. And I think even Chinese officials in their thinking about this have evolved a bit.
So yeah, I want to touch on that last part, especially the Chinese official part, and link it back into the expansion. Because when I've met with Chinese officials, whether they're coming here or it's in Korea or in China, they have come to this and said, we don't have a grand strategic vision. You might apply that in the West, but working on it internally for us, this was announced, but for us it's been very piecemeal. We've done it in some ways where we tried to go west, perhaps through the overland route, and they felt that there was a lot of U.S. pushback. So in order to respond to that, then they started to look through Southeast Asia, and they started to build there. Again, U.S. pushback. So they're very much responding, and while it looks like a grand strategy to us in terms of what they've said, and again, maybe they're just saying this to try to limit some of the U.S. pushback, but to them it feels very piecemeal, without a major plan, without an overarching strategy. So do you see an overarching strategy to this, and what is that strategy?
So I think one of the biggest challenges inherent in this perpetually expanding vision and initiative, I do think the word initiative accurately describes this. To me, strategy, first of all, I think it's much more strategic than anything the United States is currently doing. But I think the word strategy in its truest sense requires setting priorities. And the Belt and Road, at least officially, seems to try to do everything, and there hasn't been a lot of prioritization. There hasn't even been a definition for what qualifies as a Belt and Road project. So that's a real strength in getting everyone to repackage whatever they're doing as supporting the Belt and Road and getting other people to sign on. But it makes this whole thing very difficult to manage. And so I think there's the Belt and Road at the very highest level, which is what it seems like when you hear Xi Jinping give a speech about it. And then there's the Belt and Road on the ground, which is quite chaotic. And the more projects I look at, the more I'm struck by how difficult a management challenge this is.
Yeah, you mentioned briefly in there that this is more strategic than anything the U.S. is doing. So why don't we switch to the U.S. just briefly? What is the U.S. doing in terms of this?
So there's been a sort of spectrum of reactions to the Belt and Road. I think on the sort of the most initially opposed part of that spectrum was India, and it remains India, because the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is one of the 6 corridors in the Belt and Road, goes through disputed territory. The United States, I think, was initially somewhat agnostic and didn't take, at least when this was announced, didn't really take a hard position on it. And I think that was in part because, again, when this was announced 6 years ago, the U.S. was really focused on selling its own economic initiative for Asia, and that was the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And so since then, I think the U.S. has sort of shifted from awareness of this to a more hardened reaction, and certainly a lot of skepticism from U.S. officials, some suspicion about motives, and some concerns about a lot of this infrastructure is dual use. And so when you see ports being built that seem to lack some economic rationale, U.S. officials are raising questions about whether there's something else going on here.
So the dual use part I'll pick up on there. Talked about this kind of strategic vision from China, and I think the big fear of the motives that these dual use things are going to turn into extended bases, right? China already has one kind of base in Djibouti. There's perhaps another one going in through another big port being built in Cambodia, although Cambodia has said that they would never allow a Chinese base, and China has kind of said that they don't have any interest in doing that. Is this something you think that they're using the Belt and Road eventually to do, to start to build bases out, and that is going to then start to challenge the U.S. position in certain regions?
So I think it's almost an art actually to look at these projects and to start to tease out, what sort of relevance they have for security purposes. And I worry that sometimes analysts sort of jump ahead and presume that there's military intent here, without doing that work, which you really have to do on a project by project basis. So I think I do have to assume that in this flurry of activity, there are some projects being pursued that will have military implications. The way that I've thought about it is that this is really primarily an expanding set of commercial activities. That doesn't mean, though, that the military footprint couldn't follow. And I think throughout history, there are lots of examples of rising powers having expanding activities overseas, and then you need to provide security for those. But I think it's sort of that linkage rather than saying that these are sort of first and foremost military. I think that could follow though in the future.
As those interests expand, where do you think that they will first come into really close conflict with the United States and others? Is there a region, and perhaps that aligns with maybe the precursor to that question is, where is China focused most? Are they focused in Africa? Are they focused in Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia? Where is most of the money going, or perhaps to the west of China as well?
So some of the hot spots are Southeast Asia, which you know quite well. Although even though China is very active there, Japan is outspending China in several countries, and that's something that's often forgotten because we focus on China and not the fact that other countries are very involved in building infrastructure. I think one of the risks here is that the U.S. does have a global network of military facilities, and whether intentionally or not, the more Chinese commercial or ostensibly commercial activities expand, the more they're starting to rub up against that global network of military facilities in some unexpected ways. So you have, you raised the Djibouti example where there is a Chinese base, its first base on foreign soil, but there's also a Chinese free trade zone that they're building, and a rail project, and lots of telecommunications infrastructure. And the more that activity expands, I think inevitably you have a little bit of competing for prime real estate.
So in terms of the infrastructure, in some ways I think we're maybe getting ahead of ourselves looking at the strategy, looking at the U.S. response. Let's take a step back and actually look at the quality of the infrastructure they're building. Can you break down, maybe not in percentages exactly, but what types of projects they're pursuing, and then what are the challenges that of pursuing those that China is meeting as they do that, along with how has the kind of local reaction. So if they're building a railway somewhere, if it's in Africa or if it's in Southeast Asia, how has the public responded to Chinese activities in those places?
So in terms of sort of broad sets of activities, the two largest sectors in the infrastructure space are energy and transport. And so those are far and ahead, the leading sectors of activity for Chinese projects. That doesn't mean necessarily that they're the most important, but just financially speaking, those are the largest sectors. There's certainly lots of telecommunications infrastructure being built as well. And I think it's worth remembering that the world needs more infrastructure. And so I think this question about quality is key. In that range of reactions that I was describing, other countries have hammered home on this and said, you know what, this isn't about who builds the infrastructure, it's about how it's built. And so I think you have statements like that with a little more nuance coming from countries like Japan, coming from the European Union, where they say, yes, the world needs more infrastructure. It should meet the following criteria or the following principles. The G20 has put forward a set of quality infrastructure principles. So I think it's good. It would be good to pay more attention to sort of an outcomes quality-based approach rather than being against all activities done by a certain country.
And in any sense, how the public is receiving them. We hear a lot about, they're doing these activities there, but and a lot of them are built by Chinese workers that come in, and so they're not passing along the expertise to local populations. So if they build a road, they build it on an improper foundation, and then several years later, when it starts to break down, there's no one there who can actually fix it, and so some of the countries are left with these big investments that aren't necessarily useful. Have you seen any of this, and if so, do you have a specific example of that? And if not, how have the publics responded in a lot of ways to this?
Yeah, I think there are ample examples of this. I try to keep in mind that these projects, large projects, are typically delayed. They typically cost more than expected, and they typically deliver fewer benefits than expected. That's even in the best business environments. And I think we can all appreciate that if we look around at the infrastructure in the United States. It's a hard thing to do well, and China's doing this in some very difficult business environments, or trying to do it in some very difficult business environments. So I think it's natural that we see mistakes being made, that we see some learning happening as well. And so, I've certainly heard anecdotally of, talking to foreign officials from Central Asia who are disappointed that, a road is built and they have to rebuild it 15 years later. But they'll say too that, China was willing to build it at the cost that they could afford at that moment. And so having the road that only lasts for 15 years in their mind, under the political constraints that they were in, seemed like a better decision than saying no road at all. And I think that's ultimately the big challenge here. Many of the sort of worst outcomes that I see have happened when there is no alternative to the Chinese offer.
So, as you mentioned in your very beginning remarks, that we're seeing a lot of this as a way for Chinese capital to get out of the country. They have overcapacity, steel, and a lot of things are going out. What kind of concerns is this creating? Because, a lot of these are not returning. There's no return on their investment, or the return is minimal. Or they do a lot of loans, and some of those loans don't perform. Is this creating domestic challenges for the Chinese state-owned enterprises in terms of these non-performing loans, and how are they dealing with that? And is there a chance that this could become a much bigger problem for them later on?
Yeah, I think the risk to China of this set of activities has been underappreciated, especially in DC and Western capitals. When we look at this, it's often from the perspective of the threat that it might pose to us or the threat it might pose to recipient countries. I do think that there is a real set of risks to China financially and reputationally in pursuing this set of activities. It's very difficult to know what those are because it's done in a very opaque fashion. But to me, that also suggests that the risks are probably higher than even the Chinese officials themselves are aware, because they don't have, unfortunately, as far as I'm aware, we have this Reconnecting Asia project database of infrastructure projects, and I still haven't discovered of the Chinese having their own version of this, where they have all of the information in one place, where they have access to all of the various loan terms. And again, that adds to this management challenge. And I do think there is a risk of financial loss to Chinese companies when these projects start to go wrong.
And the loans are also not just on their side, but also we saw the case in Sri Lanka, where there was quite a big loan given out, and eventually they had to, I believe, turn over a port essentially to Chinese control. I'm not exactly sure for how long, or if it was just in perpetuity. And this links into a question we've gotten from the audience. Several countries have expressed concerns about Belt and Road projects being used as debt traps. Do you have any thought on the financial viability of some of these large projects?
So I think the debt trap narrative is something that's become, I think it's become part of the concern about Belt and Road, and there certainly are debt sustainability risks among many of the smaller economies who have been borrowing. And so the Center for Global Development did a study last year. This is a think tank in DC, and they identified a group of about 8 countries who they said were at highest risk of these debt issues from Belt and Road related borrowing. And so that is a real set of risks.
What countries were those? Do you know off the top of your head?
Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Mongolia, Pakistan, maybe the Maldives.
Four out of 8
Yeah.
is not bad.
And that risk is not going away. I think we've seen some projects go wrong in a relatively forgiving global economy. And that's the other thing to keep in mind is what does this look like in a less forgiving global economy? The other data point that I think is useful just to think about this in broad terms is the World Bank did a study on transport projects and in the Belt and Road corridors. And I think their sort of rough assessment was about 1/3 of the transport projects were not going to be producing any significant return. Depending on the assumptions you make, that could go as high as 2/3 in their case. So again, just there's a relatively significant fraction of these projects that are probably not going to return on the investment.
And when there is no return, then are we going to see continued cases of places like Sri Lanka where they have to turn over something like this, or the non-performing loan, meaning they're not repaying. So what do you expect to happen, especially in places like Tajikistan or some of those other countries?
So I think, again, it's tough to know without having the agreements to look at in which these terms are actually laid out. I think that because of the awareness about some of these risks, some countries have been less willing to put land as collateral. But I would also say that the debt trap narrative sometimes oversimplifies things too, because it makes it look as if China is so strategic, it's driven up some countries' debt levels to take an asset. That to me would signify a much higher degree of control over this initiative than I think is actually the case on the ground. And it also sometimes overlooks the recipient country's agency in making these decisions. And I do think, again, the debt part of this is real. But if you look at the set of, as an affiliate with our program has done, I think Agatha Kratz at the Rhodium Group and an affiliate of CSIS looked at about 40 cases of renegotiations over Belt and Road projects. And her finding was that the Sri Lanka example is actually quite rare. The Chinese are often much more willing to renegotiate parts of the loan rather than take an asset.
And we talked briefly kind of backstage about China and its soft power problem. We generally think of China with a lot of its culture, food, history, that it has this great soft power, but it's not great for your soft power when you go into a country and essentially claim one big asset for yourself. How do you think this is going to affect the BRI? It's, of course, bringing a lot more people infrastructure. It's connecting them in ways they've never maybe been connected before, or at least not recently. What effect is this having overall on China's soft power and perceptions of this? Is this something that you envision could backfire, given that it's not only soft power that they're exporting through BRI, but also we've seen this kind of work in tandem with sharp power in some places?
So I think on the front end, sort of early Belt and Road days, this was a very positive thing for China. So to have the world show up at a Belt and Road forum in Beijing, to now have 130 or however many countries signed up. And I think that speaks to the fact that even despite these mistakes and missteps in the first 6 years, this remains a relatively attractive vision for most of the world because, especially the developing world, which again needs infrastructure and needs investment. So this vision, despite its problems, speaks to those aspirations. But I think ultimately, in the sort of medium to longer term, it is going to depend on whether these projects are actually successful or not. And so it's a lot easier to promise things up front. And again, this is a really hard business to actually deliver those promises.
And has there been any effort from China to push into kind of more of America's backyard in Latin America? And if so, kind of what do those projects look like, and how will the U.S. respond?
So I think the Latin American dimension of this is newer. I think in 2017, there were some statements made about Latin America and the Caribbean being a natural extension of the maritime Silk Road. So again, expanding on that initial concept. And I think there have been about 18 countries in that region who have, ostensibly signed up to this. But it's interesting because I think the largest economies, Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, have not signed on to this. And I think that's an important lesson because you don't actually need to sign on to the Belt and Road to do Belt and Road related activities. So to give you one example, China has been investing in infrastructure in Brazil for years, but Brazil is not formally part of the Belt and Road. So the label itself, I think, shouldn't be taken, or the MOUs around the Belt and Road shouldn't be taken too seriously.
Given the kind of global extent of all the projects and how it's rolling them out, we have a question from the audience. To what extent does BRI relate to China's climate change goals?
So I think one of the interesting developments in the second Belt and Road Forum, which was held in April in Beijing, so the first forum was in May of 2017, and if you compare the two speeches that Xi Jinping gave at those forums, there's a really significant shift in how he's talking about the Belt and Road. Much more restrained in the second speech, lots of emphasis on wanting this to be green and environmentally friendly. And so also at that second forum, a whole host of environment-related initiatives have announced, the Green Silk Road Alliance, I think, being one of them. I think the jury is still out, frankly, on whether this is something that's ultimately, whether the Belt and Road is green.
How is that even possible, considering the amount of construction that's going to take place?
I think this, again, too, it's not just China. It comes down to the recipient countries and what their own goals are and what their own capabilities are for getting there. So, but I think it's there's an opening there for people who care about the environment to say, let's try to hold them to account because they've now put this forward as an expressed goal of the initiative.
So with this being kind of the initiative of Xi Jinping, of course, when this was unfurled, essentially he would have been term limited at that point, if I'm not incorrect on the timing. But now that term limit has essentially been removed, and I think there's full expectation that he's going to continue to serve for at least one more term and perhaps further on to the future. So this ties into a question from the audience. How do you think the direction of BRI has changed, or maybe better to phrase, will change now that term limits have been essentially eliminated?
So I think that this is part of something that is, in some sense, a natural part of China's rise. China was doing many of these activities before the Belt and Road was formally announced. If the Belt and Road ceased to exist in name tomorrow, I think many of these activities would continue. Certainly lots of the projects that have already been announced would continue because they're long-term projects. It's been enshrined in the Chinese Communist Party constitution, so that gives it a little bit of longevity too. But you're right, it is very associated with Xi Jinping as his signature foreign policy vision. And were he to leave office for some reason, I have to assume that someone would either just re-embrace the brand, or they would come up with a new label, because there's I think too many incentives to doing this set of activities. So I think it is something that's probably here to stay. That said, we have seen a pullback in the sort of year-on-year activity for Belt and Road related spending. 2016 was the peak so far, and a pretty significant drop last year. So what we might be looking at is a sort of smaller pipeline of projects in the future, and that might actually make the management part of this easier. So you could see Chinese officials paying more attention to project outcomes in a way that they weren't able to do with that massive set of activities in the beginning.
Do you have any indication of what is causing this drop?
So I think there's both internal constraints as well as external constraints. On the internal side, I think China's foreign exchange reserves have dropped by about a quarter since Belt and Road was announced. So they just have less cash to do these projects. My perception from both the official statements around this and some conversations is that there is a sort of there's more appreciation for the difficulty of doing this. So I think that there's probably a greater appreciation for some of the risks around this, so a little more caution. And then on the recipient side of things, I think certainly more caution. Debt sustainability is a big concern. But the demand really does remain there. So if I had to kind of pick those two factors, right, the internal constraints or the external ones, I think the internal ones are probably more important.
Mm-hmm. So as this was rolled out, one of the kind of conjoining factors was the unveiling of the AIIB, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. And when this came out, the United States said, we're not going to join it. We don't want our allies to join it, but that was not very effective. Essentially, almost everyone ended up joining in, including Japan, Korea. Everyone in the Asia joined in. I think England and many of the European countries joined in as well. Is there any pressure or any indication that the United States at some point will also join AIIB? And what would it take for the U.S. to get there? Or is the U.S. simply going to try to compete down the line of BRI?
So I think it's interesting. I don't think that there's any near-term chance that the United States is going to join. I think it's worth putting the AIIB in context with China's other activities. So I think to date it's lent less than $10 billion in projects. And China's bilateral lending mechanisms is where most of the action is. So China Development Bank, China Export-Import Bank, and so many, many times more in terms of sheer volume, with not nearly as much oversight as the AIIB. And I think the AIIB has also, for about 50% of the projects it's done, it's partnered with other multilateral development banks, and so that's allowed it to control some of its risk and learn from and adopt. In many cases, it has, copied and pasted their, approaches, and so I think all of that is reassuring. There is, historically, there's an interesting historical example. The U.S. was initially opposed to the Asian Development Bank, and so we could eventually, in some distant future, see the value in participating in this. I just don't think the political environment is there right now.
If the U.S. is going to then not join that and then perhaps try to compete with China in a number of areas, if that's even possible, well, what role do U.S. allies play in this, and what role are they playing already? And is there a better way to configure kind of the cooperation between the U.S. and its allies in a way that would allow it to compete in a more efficient way against China? Or should the U.S. compete, or should it cooperate?
I think it has to do both, and I think it needs to get better at looking at projects and deciding which of them are benign and which of them are really actually threatening to core interests, and setting its own priorities too, and not having this be just pure reaction to what China's doing. But the partners and allies dimension of this is critical, and our partners and allies like Japan are already doing, Japan has been doing infrastructure in Southeast Asia for decades. In many ways, China is sort of following in its footsteps. South Korea and others, Australia, they're active in this space. It's very difficult to bring those different players together on individual projects. And so maybe there's an approach there to look at portfolios of projects. There's probably some ways to pool investment as well. But I think that is a critical part of what the U.S. response should be.
Yeah, and especially in Southeast Asia, bringing together South Korea and Japan, given their current ongoing tensions. Instead, we have two allies building essentially the same infrastructure in different places and sometimes in close proximity to one another because of an unwillingness to cooperate. So there are challenges from the U.S. in trying to bring allies on side. To move to another question from here, one that's slightly provocative, I think. How far along is China to global hegemony, and is BRI a large or small component of Chinese influence? I think we've dealt with the second part of that in some ways, but perhaps the first part. Is China going to be the global hegemon? And that's somewhat outside of the purview of BRI, but...
I think it's definitely not there yet, and I don't see, I don't see the Belt and Road as it stands today being. I think there's as much risk to China as there is to maybe even more risk than reward right now in this set of activities it's decided to go out and do. And so I think in many of these places, it's dealing with countries that have much more experience dealing with outside powers than it has acting as an outside power. And I think it does, in some instances, run the risk of overreaching before it has become, that empire or hegemon, whatever you want, So I think the risks are real there. I'm more struck by those than I am, its ability to execute right now.
Is the same true in Europe? We've talked about Southeast Asia, where there is a real need for infrastructure, and so there's a lot of money pouring in. You see a lot of countries, even U.S. allies like the Philippines, being open to a lot of cooperation with China. Has the reaction been the same in Europe, and what kind of unique pressures does Europe face in terms of dealing with China, not only from the U.S., because we've seen the U.S. try to convince its European NATO allies that it should not be dealing with Huawei, for example, in terms of rolling out 5G. There's not been a coordinated effort. There's been a lot of pushback. Where does Europe stand on BRI, and is it ready and willing to accept a lot of the projects and funding that may come along with it?
So I think there's a range of reactions within the EU, and so I think you've seen a few countries in Central and Eastern Europe in particular be much more enthusiastic about the Belt and Road than others. And I think you've seen some examples of China exercising influence by holding out the prospect of infrastructure financing. I think there's a grouping that China uses for Central and Eastern Europe it was the 16+1 arrangement. It's now the 17+ arrangement because Greece joined this year. And I think it's a pretty smart format because it gives this set of activities a sort of cover of multilateralism when in fact it's actually a bunch of bilateral deal making between China and the countries, the 17 countries. I think ultimately, and Huawei gets to this, I think ultimately this comes down to what alternatives are out there and price. And, at the end of the day, even arguments about information security, at least for most countries, especially developing countries, are going to take a backseat to issues of price.
So at this point, we'll open it up to the audience. If you have questions, raise your hand. We'll identify you. Ask that you kind of obey the 3 good rules of question asking. Number 1, identify yourself. Number 2, be succinct. And number 3, please make sure your question is indeed a question. Right down here in front, please. We have a microphone coming around. We have the live stream going as well, so that'll be helpful for them.
First, thank you for coming, Charles Burhan. You keep mentioning the difficulty of managing Belt and Road. What exactly is the management structure within China? Is there one, BRI super agency or different agencies coordinated by some other part of the Chinese government? How is it done?
So it's a great question, and my impression of this is that the NDRC was very involved in setting up the early stages of this. So doing a lot of the policy documents that were guidance, doing some of the project selection. There have now been coordinating groups that have been set up within China at different levels, and those are set up in response to the fact that this has not been coordinated well. So you have examples of China to Europe rail services, for example. Many provinces wanted to launch their own, and you had different localities sort of competing with each other, undercutting each other with subsidies, sowing confusion because they wanted to name all these individual services after whatever the locale was that was sponsoring it. The government stepped in and has tried to coordinate some of this a bit better now. And so I think the organization part of this is still evolving a little bit. It was interesting at this most recent Belt and Road Forum. There was a group of international, mostly former government officials, non-Chinese government officials who served on a committee to sort of give recommendations about improving the Belt and Road. And one of their main recommendations was one of their observations was there's no coordinating entity between the Belt and Road forums. And of course, what happens between the forums is really the Belt and Road itself. And I think it was a sort of very diplomatically couched way of saying this needs perhaps more oversight.
We have one in the back.
Hi, Jeff Ravon. I was just curious about any types of bribery or corruption that underlies this that you're aware of, just out of curiosity.
Yeah, so I think it's fair to say that construction is one of the most corrupt sectors globally, and so this is this is a middleman's dream, basically. It's huge construction projects with opaque lending, not a lot of accountability, and so that is that's both a risk to this as well as a tool for influence, depending on how well it's controlled. So, one of the examples that has been alleged and not technically proven in court yet is in Malaysia, after their 1MDB state fund was in disarray. Chinese officials offered Malaysian officials a project deal that was inflated in part to give them extra cash. And so, not a challenge limited to China and Malaysia at all. But this is, there are examples of this in Kyrgyzstan as well. A power plant was built with one part of it missing, and it broke down in the dead of winter, leaving part of the capital of Kyrgyzstan without power. And when they did the due diligence afterwards, they realized people were getting charged $1,200 for a hammer, during the construction part of this. So my assumption is that there's quite a bit of that going on.
The woman right down here.
As far as Latin America, and mentioned if they're going to be involved in projects in Latin America, the United States, our projects, it seems like in the past have always been take the natural resources, and is the United States done much investing in projects that are other than natural resources that I'm just not aware of? And it sounds like China hasn't got there yet, but what do you think about that?
So I think, the U.S. companies have participated in this in a variety of ways. So those China to Europe rail services that I mentioned, one of the first users of them was Hewlett-Packard, because they had production facilities in Western China and they wanted to ship product to customers in Europe. So that's one example. There are companies that have sold components into Belt and Road projects. So GE and Honeywell have sold parts into Belt and Road power plants. And I think that there's a sort of private sector investor set of interests in this as well. But that really comes down to whether the risk is controlled. And so, I think a lot of the groups in the U.S. that invest in infrastructure tend to look at developed economies, because the risk is more, OECD economies. But part of this new U.S. Development Finance Corporation that's been set up, part of the intent is to use government money to help mitigate some risk and unlock some of that private capital. So I know there's certainly an interest in doing that. My own experience has been focused more on the Eurasian supercontinent, because that's what our project focuses on. But I know that on the government side, there's certainly interest in doing more there.
Yes, sir.
My name is Gunter Nitsch. Who owns and administrates the Port of Piraeus in Greece?
So it's my perception that a subsidiary of COSCO, so the Chinese shipping giant, is primarily responsible for owning and operating the port there. It's an interesting example, because I think as far as Belt and Road affiliated projects go, it's actually been quite commercially successful. Throughput has gone up significantly. But it raises the question about soft power and what does it get you? I think, according to the polling I've seen, Greek citizens are still quite ambivalent in terms of how they feel about China. They welcome the investment. They're concerned about its labor practices, its environmental policies. And in the case of ports, if you go to, modern ports don't require very many people. And that's another challenge. So a really well-oiled, well-operating port doesn't create a lot of local jobs, or at least as many as it used to.
Yeah, the gentleman back here.
Mark Wilson. Is labor imported, or is it sourced locally? In other words, are Chinese laborers coming in for the construction side of the projects, or are they sourced from local labor pools?
So my impression is that it varies quite widely depending on the project, and that's often a big point in negotiations around the project. So again, just anecdotally, I've heard that if country A finds out that country B got a higher local labor percentage in its contract, it's going to drive a hard bargain to get that higher local labor quota. Chinese workers are often involved because that's part of the incentive. China has, I think, 7 or 8 of the world's 10 largest construction companies, and so when it sends those companies out, it almost always has that top layer of management, but then the layers below that can vary depending on the recipient country's ability to both provide workers itself, whether it can make the case that it has the workforce that's ready to do these projects, as well as its own leverage, frankly, whether it has another option that it could take in that negotiation.
Well, while others think of their questions, we'll take one from the online contribution. And it's something we don't often think about. Most of the discussion has been about how the outside world is viewing BRI, how the US is going to respond, how Europe, Latin America, Southeast Asia. A question here turns this into a domestic question as well. What is current public opinion within China on Belt and Road, and have there been changes over time? Now, with the caveat that knowing public opinion within China is incredibly difficult. There are some firms that do it, and they work with outside firms. In fact, we here at the council have worked with one of the polling firms. The way they do their polling is a little bit different, that mostly done in cities. You rarely get kind of a rural sample. And then, the way that they do them as well is oftentimes face-to-face. This creates a whole other set of issues. So ensuring that it's random and it's probably not nationally representative. So understanding public opinion can be difficult. But I don't think, we're looking for an absolute number here, but just kind of a general perception. Because on the one hand, you may see this is a promotion of Chinese power abroad. And in that sense, it ties into nationalism. They can feel proud that they're out there. But on the other hand, you have an inordinate amount of money flowing out of the country for limited returns in most cases. So do you have any sense about where this is, especially that President Xi has really taken this on as his own initiative, and if there's going to be a continuance or a growing number of failures among this, I think the point is then, does this then tie directly back to President Xi and then add into this kind of undermining of his political power, especially in terms of what we've seen in Hong Kong and how that's starting to flow back as well?
So I think in the earliest days, this was something that could be supported because anything could be fit under the broad Belt and Road banner, right? So you had certainly large companies who had essentially run out of things to build in China were enthusiastic about this because it gave them a sort of new business opportunity. But then you had things, there were Belt and Road fashion shows, there were Belt and Road art exhibits, people were saying dentistry is part of the Belt and Road if you're a dentist. So everyone, I think, there's this sort of campaign around, rallying around this idea, and a lot of repackaging of whatever it is that you do to fit under this banner. So that works in a situation in which the set of activities is big enough to give everyone something, right? So that's sort of Belt and Road 1.0. But Belt and Road has been dialing back a little bit, and growth in China has been declining a little bit. And so I think there's both less to go around as well as some concerns in China that, if we're not growing as fast, this is something that would be, you could imagine in the American political context, who would support spending hundreds of billions of dollars on foreign infrastructure when they see something around them going not as good as they had expected. Also, anecdotally, I think there was a Belt and Road film released in the past few months, and it was not a big box office hit, and I think it was criticized widely on Chinese social media, at least until the comments were all pulled down. But I think there's a little bit of skepticism growing.
Questions, or should I turn back to? Okay, we have a gentleman down here in the front.
My name's Aaron Maslyansky. My question is about the satellites that they're putting in space. And is that part of the Belt and Road Initiative, and how does that affect the competition with GPS, and should the U.S. be concerned?
So it's described by Chinese officials as being part of the Belt and Road. To be honest, I'm not sure if it's. It is a form of connectivity. I guess we could say it is a form of connectivity. So certainly closer to the core concept than the dentistry is. I don't honestly know on the technology side. I'm not the person to compare the two. I know that the number of satellites. China's system now exceeds the number of GPS satellites. So in terms of quantity, they have something to point to. But again, in terms of quality, I'm not sure.
So what are China's rights of recourse against these countries to the extent a loan goes bad or if there's a global downturn? Do their remedies have teeth, and can we see any of the remedies evolving into something a little bit more like a skirmish, if you will? Alternatively, can they just sort of take over a port, let's say, and now say, I have exclusive rights to this port because you, member country, didn't honor your obligations?
So I think from a legal perspective, it's definitely going to depend again on the agreement and sort of what you put as collateral, and the terms around how a dispute is settled can vary depending on what was negotiated. In some agreements, China is successful in getting a partner to say that disputes need to be settled in Beijing, in courts in Beijing, rather than in an international arbitration. And if you're a self-interested actor, why wouldn't you ask for that? And some countries are just, haven't been as successful in identifying that as a risk or making the sort of the pushback they need to have it done in a neutral setting. There have been, I think, 2 Belt and Road courts that have been established now in China. And so again, I think that speaks to the fact that officials are recognizing these projects are hard. They often lead to disputes. That's not just a challenge for China. And so they would prefer to have those disputes handled at home and in their courts. I think that even though this broad set of activities in some cases does have some imperial echoes, I think, when you look at what Western powers were doing, in the 1800s, the rules, around how you can act and what you can do have changed dramatically. And so I do think that, even though there are some of these parallels, that this competition has become much more difficult to play as an outside power.
Okay, we'll take this question in the back.
Sorry about that. I guess since BRI was scaled back from, 1.0, how active has the Chinese private sector been since then versus before?
You're wondering if it's had an impact on China's domestic economy? I'm honestly not sure. It's the challenge of knowing. I think in terms of those dates, I think you've seen a decline in the growth rate, but I'm not sure that the cause of that is a reduction in Belt and Road activity. I'm just not sure.
There's a lot of competing factors going on there all at the same time, so trying to suss out the causation is a real challenge.
And not a lot of good data.
Yeah. And what data you can get is often not accurate anyway.
Yeah.
Yes.
My question is about the Middle East world. How do you think the reaction of the Middle East in the initiative?
The reaction in the Middle East. It's interesting. I think the percentage of project activity in the Middle East has gone up as the overall set of activity has gone down. So this seems to be a region that has been figuring more prominently in the Belt and Road over the past 2-3 years. So I think there's something interesting there. Beyond that, I'm not sure I have too much more to add.
Is this a way for China's kind of seeking energy security, and that it's going to try to do that? So it has pipelines or coming through the Straits of Malacca. Is it energy related? Half of, or sorry, not half, but the 2 biggest sectors again are transport and energy, and so I think there's certainly an energy interest. In Africa in particular, there have been resource for loan deals where the collateral that's provided is natural resources, and so China didn't invent that model. Japan did a lot of that in the 1980s. There's certainly a strong energy interest. Yes, in the back.
Eric Schandorf. In terms of data, are you receiving this? Where are your sources? Are they coming directly from China, or are they coming from the outside parties that are participating in all of the projects?
So our philosophy with this Reconnecting Asia project is it's always a work in progress. We're willing to take information from and updates from anyone who can make the case that what they have is more credible. And it's a lot of piecing things together. We track more than just what China's doing. Some actors like the World Bank are very transparent. They put all of their, you can find all the project documentation on their websites. For tracking Chinese projects, it's often difficult, and so you start with public announcements. Sometimes that's officials, press releases. Sometimes it's local newspapers in the recipient country, and that's, in some cases too, we also use satellite imagery to see if the bridge that was announced is actually there, or if work is beginning. But it's almost like a sort of an investigation rather than an easy kind of collection of all the points.
Then I'll take, we have one more question down in front.
Oh, thank you. Charles Burhan again. If we get beyond our paranoia, and if you view this as an evolving marketplace, can you see a situation where the Chinese need partners and Western banks and Western institutions come in on a selective basis and become, co-owners of projects, or even create a secondary market for bad markets where the Chinese want to bail out?
I think you can see interest in that already. Certainly there are financial institutions in Western Europe who have been involved in Belt and Road related deals. And I think on the U.S. side, there's certainly an interest in providing more, in financing more infrastructure. I think, again, it comes down to what kind of infrastructure that is and whether you can mitigate risk effectively. There's something about the Belt and Road label that I think is not going to encourage everyone to get on board. So I think if we were able to move away from that and just focus on whether infrastructure meets the right criteria, rather than what the political branding is around it, I think that might open up opportunities.
Yes, one final question.
Hi, what do you do? What would you do? Do you sell the data that you collect? Who uses the data that you collect? Do the Chinese come and use your data? I know you said they don't really collect your own. What's the purpose of you collecting the data?
So our basic mission is to see what the sort of ground reality is with these projects. And again, we track more than just China. So I won't give you the whole origin story of the project, but it really is the most basic goal is to have some evidence to know what is happening and what is not happening, because there's a lot of rhetoric around these initiatives, and things often move a lot slowly or much slower on the ground. In terms of who uses the information, it's all publicly available. So the Chinese are certainly welcome to use it, and I know Chinese scholars who have used it and cite it. We have journalists who use it quite frequently. So we've collaborated with the Financial Times on their reporting, The Economist, National Geographic, when they have an explorer who's going on a out of Eden walk. And so when he was walking through Central Asia, they wanted to do an overlay of the old Silk Road and the new Silk Road. And so we provided some data for that. So it is supposed to be an open platform. And certainly welcome all of you to use it and to let us know how to improve it too. That's the other part of this, that we welcome corrections and improvements. So we were created with a gift that was given in honor of Zbigniew Brzezinski, former national security advisor, whose mental map of the world was the Eurasian supercontinent. And so that's why we focus on that region. And then since then, we've attracted funding from a combination of foundations, a few private sector partners, and we recently got a grant from the State Department, but that's as of last week. So that's new. We're excited about that. We're hoping, when you work in a think tank, you want to influence policy. And we're hoping that the information we collect can be useful.
So with that, I really would encourage everyone, if you have any curiosity about this, to visit the website Reconnecting Asia, because it really is almost a public service. And a lot of the researchers will see it that way because you have this ability to narrow the topics or the projects by rail, by road, by energy, by power plants. You can really go through and narrow down and see what's being done where. So it's a great resource for anyone that is interested in this. With that, we'll go ahead and wrap up. Please join me in thanking John for joining us today.